I've never considered my neighborhood to be particularly safe. I've been accosted by men in cars while walking home from school or public transit more than once. But that's not what I'm writing this to talk about. Those aren't a huge deal comparatively. There are actually two separate events and I have no way of knowing if they're actually connected. Considering this happened to me around 7 years ago, I probably never will. I'd like to think that logically they are connected considering they started and stopped around the same time frame. I am fairly certain that I had a stalker or something along those lines for about a year. My bedroom has a long, narrow window in it that faced my front yard. We have two huge trees in the front that always leave a thick blanket of dead leaves on the yard, and because of those trees we also have a lot of squirrels. I can hear them tumbling around on the roof sometimes, as well as rifle around in the leaves in front of my window. I became pretty accustomed to the sound. It was just a gentle shuffling and crunching noise. At some point, inexplicably, I started hearing the same noises, but they were much louder, deeper, and more deliberate sounding. You know, the movements of a squirrel are really twitchy and spastic. This was not the case. It was pretty easily identifiable as a person walking around right in front of my window. I'm one to sort of face a threat head on instead of backing out. I only opened my curtains partially to look once and confirm it was a person. It was dark and the features were indistinguishable, and at the time he was sort of off to the side and out of my immediate sight. I got into the habit of banging on my window hard if I heard them outside. It was usually followed by the sound of them rushing away, because I suppose I scared them. I took it a step further once and moved to my front door, directly to the right of my room, and flung it open. I turned on my front porch light and yelled "fuck off." And that again made them run off in the opposite direction. I wasn't taking that shit from them and I tried to make that super obvious. It's not like I wasn't alarmed, I just think my defensive instincts outweighed anything else during that time. I told my mom and her then boyfriend. My mom didn't believe me, thinking it was the squirrels. Her boyfriend did. He got a plank of wood, hammered nails through it, and laid it upside down in front of my window like a makeshift trap. We were so smug about it. The person would come now and again. There were maybe 20 instances in total if I remember correctly. In addition to that, there was something more alarming. Back then, I would walk to the bus to go to school at around 8 a.m. There was always a car which drove down the road at the same time, which was normal, seemingly. I mean, I was leaving the same time every day, and they probably had a job that had them do the same. I remembered it specifically because it was jet black with tinted windows. The license plate had a green light installed to shine on it, and I thought that was awesome because my favorite color was green. But, as you may have already assumed, this car was not as innocuous as I thought. One day it slowed to a crawl beside me, moving just enough to keep in pace with my walking. I didn't know what to do other than keep walking. I couldn't see inside the car at all because of the tinted windows. Then I stopped, and the car stopped as well. The windows rolled down, and I didn't get a good look at the person inside because the first thing I saw is some type of gun pointing straight at me from inside the car. I think my brain just kind of shut down because that memory is so hazy for me. It was probably a handgun of some kind, and I was frozen because I didn't know what was happening. I just stood there in shock. Then, after what was probably only a couple of seconds, the person pulled the gun back into the car, rolled the window up, and sped off. I don't know what they were planning or if they just wished to scare me. All of the fun black car and window stalker adventures ended after that. So hey, weirdo, whatever you thought you were doing, just stay away from my house and let's not meet, alright? This happened when I was 16 years old. I had just gotten out of my first ever serious relationship. I guess you could call this guy my rebound guy, though technically I only met with him once. I met this guy on an out-of-town shopping trip with my best friend Lena the week after my breakup with my ex, Thomas. At this time I was all about heavy metal, hard rock, and wouldn't wear anything unless it was black or at least at the darker end of the grey spectrum, and preferably adorned with a pentagram or two. My ex was the same, and a lot of my friends were also of the type where finding anything in their closet in the morning was like playing hide and seek in the dark. Lena, however, wasn't, which was probably why my rebound guy, Lars, latched onto me instead of her. Lars was a year older than us, and the teenaged me found him pretty hot. Like me, he seemed to have an aversion to colors, a few piercings, and this short spiky hairstyle that was pretty popular at the time. He really just seemed like a normal good-looking guy with similar interests to mine. So I, with my lower than average self-esteem, thought I was extremely lucky to meet someone like him, though we lived in different towns. I couldn't have been more wrong. Lena and I had been on a serious shopping spree for about half a day when we met Lars for the first time. He was helping his family run one of those street stalls that sold rings and trinkets, and casually struck up a conversation with me whilst I looked at a red Gothic-inspired ring. We found out we liked the same kind of music, games and comics, and hit it off pretty quickly. He asked for a break from his father and started walking around with us. He even bought me the ring I'd been looking at, which of course immediately melted my teenage heart. But still, I wasn't looking for a long-distance relationship or anything. I'd just gotten out of a relationship the week before, felt unattractive. My boyfriend had cheated on me for the last 4 months of our relationship, and just liked being appreciated. However, it didn't take all that long before I realized Lars was stranger than I'd first thought. Unfortunately, I'd already given him my number and shared what is still to this day the most uncomfortable kiss I've ever gotten. Let's just say I feel for Harry Potter, because I now know how awful it is to have a demented try to suck your soul out through your mouth. It started innocently enough. He'd get curious when we mentioned any of our other friends, who me are mainly boys. Keep in mind we'd only known him for about 3 hours at this time. Then he started asking me when I was going to move into his town to be with him. When I told him I wasn't planning on moving anywhere, he got offended. He then started ranting about demons and the likes. Finally, enough was enough, and Lena and I told him we had to go, and I tried to gently turn him down and walk away from him. This was around the time he started begging me not to go back home on the bus and instead come home with him to stay the night with his family. I told him to leave me alone and to never contact me. He sounded a bit offended, but he mumbled something about having to work anyway and left us alone. I seriously thought that was the last of it. But as we walked around looking at other shops in town, Lena caught Lars following us. By now we were thoroughly creeped out. It was winter time, and in Norway it gets dark pretty early in the winter. Hell, the sun barely bothers to grant us any daylight hours at all, so the streets were already pretty dark by then. We tried losing him several times, but he kept finding us again. Finally we gave up and decided to take an earlier bus back to our town, disappointed that this guy had cut our shopping trip short. Fast forward a few days. I started receiving several texts and phone calls a day from this guy. Now, I just had an old Nokia with a prepaid SIM card and no idea how to block people's numbers, so all I could do was try to ignore him whilst he got increasingly weird. I don't have the texts or even the same number anymore, of course, since this was 10 years ago. But I do remember he kept talking as if we were a couple, continuously asking when I was moving to his town, telling me he loved me, explaining to me that I loved him. He got increasingly worse, getting sexually explicit in his messages and saying he was coming over to stay in my town and in my house until I was ready to move to him. After a few weeks of him texting and calling me, finding and stalking me online via MySpace and completely creeping me out, I just snapped. I answered one of his many phone calls and told him to lose my number, told him he was creeping me out, lied about a new guy in my life, and told him to stay away from me. I hung up before he had a chance to say anything back to me. That's when things went from slightly creepy to downright weird. He started telling me he would kill himself if I didn't go out with him. But later the text messages just got weirder. He told me he would go out to the graveyard and cut out his eyes to become a demon if I didn't date him, and that his demon self would come after me. He even wrote something along the lines of "I know how to become a demon, my 2 cats are demons," as if that was definite proof. He then started quoting some sort of satanic texts, talking about how I would have to be his girl if he was a demon and sending me twisted poetry. I told him to just go ahead and become one, but to stay the hell away from me. After a few more weeks of this, some weird MMS messages of him wearing white contacts, some pentagram pictures, and just more random talk about becoming his demon bride, he kind of just tapped out and I continued on with my life. Got a new boyfriend and was happy. He'd still text me from time to time, but once I changed my number I never heard from him again. Pretty anticlimactic really, though it was freaking me out when it was happening. A few years later he showed up in my town. Clearly he never joined his cats and became a demon. Lena ran into him in town. He'd apparently asked her how I was before telling her he was having sex with basically half the female population of our town as well as his. He then invited her to his hotel room for a private party. When she turned him down, he asked her if she thought I would be interested to meet up with him to catch up. She gave him a piece of her mind and walked away quickly. Neither of us have seen him since, thankfully. So, Lars, let's not meet. Not in your hometown, not in a graveyard, and definitely not in some seedy hotel room you're supposedly renting. This happened when I was about 4. My mum had to bring me to the hospital with her because no one is babysitting me. Later, when we were in the main entrance, the guard told her that I can't come in with my mom because my aunt is in a ward where kids my age are not allowed. We waited outside for my aunt's husband to come out and watch me, so that my mom can go see her sister. When he came out, my mom went in and I was left with my irresponsible uncle, who I blame for my extreme paranoia. Few minutes later, a man came to talk to my uncle. I didn't hear what they talked about, but my uncle nodded at this sketchy guy and that guy came to me. "I'm your uncle. Wanna play?" he asked. He didn't look like an uncle to me. I never saw him before, so I didn't wanna go, but he grabbed me by the arm and I was forced to walk away with him. I was really uncomfortable, but I was just a kid. I was confused that I let him drag me away. I looked back, and my uncle was gone. My irresponsible uncle was gone in a split second. As we walk away, this guy is bending down at me to kiss me. I mean, who does that? We were practically walking away and he would stop me to kiss me. He did that multiple times, and I felt more uncomfortable. I wanna cry then, but I didn't. We stopped at a small park that is adjacent to the hospital. He let me sit on a swing and he kissed me even more, caressing my legs this time. No uncle did that to me. Something in my gut tells me that I should stay away from this man, so I stood up and walked away from him. "What's wrong?" he asked. I never talked when he talks to me. I looked at him when he asked that, and then I ran away as fast as I can. When I saw the entrance of the hospital and looked back, he was not running after me. He was calmly walking behind me. My uncle was there, pacing. A few minutes later, my mom came walking to me from a different direction, not from the park, not from inside the hospital, but from the way direction we both came into the main entrance a while ago. I now think that she must have looked for me on the main road that leads to the hospital. That means my freaking uncle didn't know where that guy took me. She looked so worried and she just grabbed me away from that strange man. I never told her what happened. I never told anyone. No one asked what happened when that man took me away. Since then, every man I saw with a long hair crept me out. My little brain never processed what he looked like. When I remember that day, he's just a man with a blank face. I was a paranoid little girl. I got very upset whenever an uncle with a long hair talked to me. I even have a grandpa with a long hair and I started disliking him. Since that day, my mum has taken me in the hospital with a safety mask on. Also, my older sister started to lecture me about strange guys who offer little kids candy bar and then take them away, never coming back. I was not impressed by her lecture. That guy who took me away didn't even offer me a candy bar. I'm still traumatized to this day, that I sometimes lose it when my husband flirts with me. Thank you for listening to these true scary stories from Reddit. I promise the next videos to come will be better sounding. This is my very first video, after all. Subscribe if you want to hear more true scary stories from Reddit. You can also find the usernames of the authors, and links to the site in the description below. Have a nice night.